And welcome back to our next edition of the CBB Review Studio podcast. I am Dan Siegel, joined by my co-host Matt Majinski today. And we are starting part one of our 5-part series where we'll be looking at past recruiting top 25s, this time starting with the 2017 recruiting class, just determining whether they were a boom, whether they were a bust based on their recruiting ranking and what they're up to today, what they've been up to since their college careers, and what they amounted to. So let's get started. I am going to send it to you, Matt. You're going to review all of the odds today. So number 25.
Yeah, we've got Jalen Hance, a guy who played at UCLA. And I feel like, if you remember Hance, obviously, he was a pretty good college player. I mean, he didn't stay at UCLA more than, only his 2 years, got drafted in the late rounds in the NBA. But as far as Jalen Hance's pro career, he's playing in Spain right now. He just didn't really turn into maybe the, 4/5 star that people thought he might be able to. That was a time period where I feel like UCLA had a lot of talent. So maybe some of these other guys got, people thought they were maybe better than they actually were. And I'm not saying that was really the case with Hance. Again, really good college player. But I'd say overall, I wouldn't call it – he definitely isn't like a total bust because he was picked in the late rounds of the draft, but he just really didn't turn into anything. So if I had to go with anything, I guess you'd have to say just right there in the middle. I mean, honestly, that's like the perfect assessment for Jalen Hance.
The next one, I think this is the easiest decision I've made. Number 24, Trae Young, absolutely a boom. He was a star at Oklahoma, leading the NCAA in both points and assists in his lone season. And in the NBA, he's been a 3-time All-Star. Now he can be a little bit frustrating for people who have any stock in any other player on the Atlanta Hawks, but absolutely star at both levels. Trae Young, easy decision. That's a boom.
Yeah, I was going to say, you got the easy one there. I got an interesting one here, probably the most interesting one on this list. Silvio De Sousa, a guy who played for Kansas and Chattanooga and will always be remembered for the brawl that he was involved in against Kansas State. That was just an insane thing that happened. I mean, one of the biggest college basketball just overall moments, I feel like, in the past 4 or 5 years, really in the past decade that I can remember. But as far as what De Sousa turned into, I mean, he's playing in Greece right now. I mean, he really just never got a true shot in the NBA. Greece is not a bad league. I'll say a little bit more of a bust because I feel like he was a bigger name at Kansas than Jalen Hance was at UCLA, if I want to argue that. But again, I don't think anyone expected Silvio De Sousa to come in the NBA and average 20 points a game. That was never anything that wasn't his game. He definitely brought some toughness to Kansas. But, yeah, that's where he is now, is playing in Greece.
All right, number 22, Emmanuel Akot, someone who went to Arizona, never really panned out. Transferred down, had a couple of solid seasons at Boise State, ended up finishing his career at Western Kentucky and averaged 10 points per game on a Western Kentucky team. I think that was 2022 to 23, a team that had a lot of high major talent and really underperformed. So nothing really much. I'm calling him a bust right now. He's playing for the Netherlands for the Heroes Den Bosch. So not really much, number 22 recruit, never panned out at the high major level, isn't having an NBA career. So I'd consider him a bust.
Okay, I said that Silvio De Sousa was the most interesting guy on this list. I lied because it's actually Chris Wilkes. Played 2 years at UCLA alongside Jalen Hance, by the way. So obviously a pretty stacked recruiting class for UCLA. Had some pretty good stats in college. Over 17 points a game, about 5 rebounds a game. Looked like he was going to get drafted. Then he picked up a rare autoimmune disease. Actually never was able to play in Summer League because of it. Wasn't even able to get his NBA dream. Who knows what he would have panned into. Tried to make a comeback down the line. Again, this was a scary thing for Chris Wilkes. Read something where it said he couldn't even feel his legs on draft night. I mean, this was a big-time thing. Some sickness that he had to get over. He contemplated, again, trying to get back into the NBA. Of course, wasn't able to happen. But I think I read another thing where, everything happens for a reason type of thing. That's the way he's looking at this. But again, outstanding college basketball player. And I think I want to say that he is a boom because of the way that he looked at what happened to him and his career and his outlook on life. So that's what Chris Wilkes is for me.
Yeah. Wouldn't be fair to call him a bust. Like you call people bust because like they didn't play as well as you wanted them to. But in this case, I think that's a very good assessment of that. Moving on to number 20. This is an interesting guy, Billy Preston. I reached out to our guy Ariel Puderman, who is a big at CB Review, and he went to Kansas, so he knows a little more about the situation. And here's what he basically told me. He had some sort of incident where he was in an accident, a car accident, but the car wasn't registered to him. It was instead registered to one of his coaches. And, that's basically NCAA violations. Before it was cool, before the NIL era. So that's not good. Ended up not playing a single minute for Kansas despite signing there. He ended up signing overseas. And then he never really made the NBA other than a brief stint with the Cleveland Cavaliers. I think he played 3 games and just a couple minutes in each. Now he's playing for the Cape Town Tigers of the Basketball African League, the BAL. That I think he's a bust, but like very interesting scenario. Somebody I like completely forgot about until we did this exercise. So Billy Preston is a name I'm mentioning today.
Yeah, I feel like that's one thing that we've noticed in common is a lot of these guys. It's like, oh, I totally forgot about that guy. Yeah. Well, this next guy, we know who he is. Gary Trent Jr., 5 straight years, averaging almost like just under 14 points per game. Is in the past 5 years, his lowest total was like 13.7 points per game. Of course, playing for the Raptors right now, played for the Blazers before. I mean, Gary Trent Jr. has had a pretty successful career in the NBA. And, basically what he was at Duke was a shooter, and he's been a shooter and a scorer in the NBA. I mean, to me, he's a boom because you're a top 20, you're a 5-star, whatever, but you know that not all 5 stars pan out. But Gary Trent is someone that has made a living in the NBA, is making a lot of money in the NBA. Clear boom.
Mm-hmm. And then Brian Bowen, someone who another scandal guy, right? He originally signed to play at Louisville, was involved heavily in that Rick Pitino thing and suspended for the season. And then he enrolled in South Carolina, but the NCAA wouldn't let him play that year either. Ended up not playing a single college minute, just like Billy Preston, and signed overseas. Very similar storyline. He had a brief stint in the NBA for the Pacers, but he's been mostly G Leagues and overseas. And currently, I believe I saw he's on the Stockton Kings, which is the Sacramento affiliate. So didn't have any college career, did not have much of an NBA career. I think that's my 3rd consecutive guy I'm calling a bust.
Yeah, that was a weird situation for him. You kind of feel bad sometimes for stuff like that, especially now in the age of NIL where these guys got screwed and guys nowadays are living the dream. Nick Richards also kind of living the dream. I mean, he's an NBA player when it gets down to it. He was drafted in 2020 by the Pels, immediately traded to the Hornets. He's stayed in the NBA. He might not be your everyday household name. I actually didn't know that he was an everyday NBA guy at this point, but he's averaged throughout his career about 7 points, 5 rebounds, a block per game. I mean, that's like Nick Richards is a guy that you might not think of every day. You got to do a little research, which is what I had to do. But then you're like, okay, like this guy is making some money in the NBA. Seems like he's sticking around. So props to him. And based on his style of play, I'll say he's a boom because he's not like your Joel Embiid 3-point shooting, machine that's going to drive the ball. I mean, Nick Richards, a little bit less than that, but he's still found a way to make a living and collect those rebounds. Sometimes that's just what a team needs.
All right, finally, I'm going to call someone a boom. Lonnie Walker, who I feel like everybody forgets that he had that year at Miami. Like, everyone forgets he was a one-and-done guy because he wasn't awesome at Miami. He was good, not great, but he was drafted 18th overall. And he's just been a decent NBA role player, which for anybody, that's perfectly, serviceable. Like, you're perfectly happy with that. He came off the bench for Brooklyn this year. Again, not a guy who was a star in college, not a guy who was a star in the NBA, but I think he did the bare minimum to live up to his 5-star rating. So I'll call him a boom if I have to choose one.
Yeah, definitely like that pick. Let's go to the next screen here. PJ Washington, Kentucky, a clear boom. I don't even have to really get into this. If you've been watching the NBA playoffs at all, you've noticed that PJ Washington has been a key for the Dallas Mavericks. We know Luka Doncic. We know Kyrie Irving. PJ Washington has stepped up in that series for Dallas, all playoffs long, really. And again, we saw what he was capable of at Kentucky, but I just feel like he's improved so much more now that he's in the NBA. He's really just become more of an all-around player. PJ Washington, like many Kentucky players, is a boom.
And then Brandon McCoy is our next guy. Kind of a surprise commit to UNLV given his rating, and he obviously had offers all over the place from all of the Blue Bloods and prize programs in the country. He did have a phenomenal season at UNLV. I'll give him that. He had 17 points, 10 rebounds, had a couple blocks per game, was just a stud. But that's at the Mountain West level. Then he goes to the NBA draft. And then, I'm sorry, the Mountain West, like not as good back then either. Goes to the NBA draft, undrafted, never really stuck around in an NBA organization. Right now, I looked it up. He's playing for the Tijuana Zonkies in Mexico. So I'd call him a bust just because he didn't play at the high major level, only spent 1 year, and then didn't really pan out in the NBA, even though he wasn't like maybe considered the NBA prospect that a lot of these other guys are. For the number 14 overall recruit, if I have to choose one for the way his career trajectory was, I'm going to say bust.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm going to give a bust with this next pick too. Troy Brown played during one of kind of like the height of Oregon basketball when Oregon seemed to be like a contender for a couple of years there under Dana Altman. And he had a very good career at Oregon. I mean, you're talking about 1 year, but he was the 15th overall pick, so just outside the lottery. So I think that's why I've got to call Troy Brown a bust because, I mean, overall, he's played in the NBA, all right? He's played over 300 games in the NBA. And he's, he found a little bit of an niche for himself. But when you're talking about a 5-star recruit who ends up being the 15th overall pick in the draft, like he lived up to it in college, but that hasn't translated to the NBA. So for that reason, I've got to call Troy Brown a bust.
Yeah. If you're spending like a bunch of years in college, you have a great college career, and then you don't turn out great in the NBA, that's a different story. But if you leave early, I feel like that's part of the criteria.
Mm-hmm.
Number 12, Jared Vanderbilt, definitely a boom. He was injured for most of his lone year at Kentucky, so he didn't really do much, and then got drafted in the second round. So the expectations weren't even that high, but since then, he's played for the Nuggets, he's played for the Timberwolves, the Jazz, and the Lakers. But even though nothing has been eye-popping there, you can't complain about getting tens of millions of dollars and having a sustained NBA career. So I'm definitely calling that a boom.
Well, you're calling that a boom. This next guy is one of the biggest busts known to man, Kevin Knox, a lottery pick by the New York Knicks. I'm a New York Knicks fan. This is a tough time for me. Don't know when you're watching this, but as we're recording this, Game 7's coming up on Sunday. Luckily, Kevin Knox is not a part of this because Kevin Knox was one of the worst Knicks players in my lifetime based on what he was thought to do, everything the Knicks built him up to do. And I know that he's kind of stayed around the NBA, even in the G League, and that kind of says a little bit about Kevin Knox. But for what his skill set looked like at Kentucky, he was just, It's not even worth talking about at this point. He is.
All right, moving on to the next slide. We've got Hamidou Diallo, definitely a bust. He did win an NBA dunk contest, so good for him. But this is another more complex situation. He ended up reclassifying a year early, but then never ends up being able to play in his first year at Kentucky. Was considered a pretty good NBA prospect, but decided to go back to Kentucky and actually play. And he was okay, not even too great, but I think that really plummeted his draft stock. And he was in the second round. Had a couple decent years in the NBA with OKC and then Detroit, but just didn't really pan out much in the NBA either. He's currently on a 2-way contract with the Wizards, kind of up and down, mostly in the G League. So I'm calling that a bust.
It's full circle for me now as a Knicks fan because Mitchell Robinson is a boom, got that contract. I know that he's injured right now, and it really sucks because Mitchell Robinson has been a crucial part of the Knicks for the past couple of years. You talk about a guy coming out of Western Kentucky and living up to the hype as a shot blocker, a rebound, hasn't really developed an offensive game too much, but it doesn't matter because he understands his role and he fits in perfect with this Knicks team. Hopefully he'll be there for a lot longer because Mitchell Robinson, whether he comes off the bench how he had in the playoffs before he got hurt, whether he started, he has always been a guy who can bring energy and a guy who knows what he has to do.
Sorry about that. But yeah, speaking of guys that have their roles cut out on the defensive end and know who they are, how about Jaren Jackson? Played at Michigan State, had a good year. Big Ten Freshman of the Year, Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year, 4th overall pick, and has just been a stud in the NBA for the Grizzlies. One of the best defensive players in the league. He led the league in blocks twice. He made his first All-Star game last year. Just definitely a guy who, like Mitchell Robinson, like just knows their role, stud on the defensive end, and absolutely maximized what they could do with their top 10 high school recruiting talent.
Trayvon Duval is one of the biggest busts on this list. You're talking about a 5-star point guard that goes to Duke, only stays 1 year. And where is he now? Turkey. He's playing basketball in Turkey. Now, I do want to preface this with saying I understand that not everyone turns out. That's why we have this. There's going to be booms. There's going to be busts. Trayvon Duval is still playing pro basketball. But it's just that career arc where you're a top, not even just a 5-star, a top 10 recruit. You're ranked as, either the first or second best point guard in this recruiting class. You go to Duke. You're living the dream. And, it just doesn't work out. And I feel like maybe he should have stayed another year at Duke. I feel like he was a guy that could have used that. But I get it. You have all this hype. You believe in yourself. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. But there's no denying that Trayvon Duval is a bust.
Number 6, Colin Sexton, a guy who overall I'm definitely calling a boom. Had a great year at Alabama. Do you remember that SEC tournament 2017? Yeah. He was putting up like 40, 38, 37, like just crazy numbers. Did have some complications when he declared for the draft. Of course, that scandal, that complicated things, NCAA violations before getting paid was cool and all that. But ended up being drafted 8th overall and has been a good NBA player since. Had that one huge year in Cleveland. I forgot which year that was, but there's one year where he absolutely went off for the Cavaliers. Now he's playing for the Jazz. Just exactly what you'd want out of the number 6 overall recruit. Colin Sexton lived up to it. He's a boom.
Yeah, and then we move into our top 5. Wendell Carter, another guy who played alongside Trayvon Duval at Duke, but Carter kind of the opposite. He turned into a boom. Now, I'll say this: you're a top 5 pick or a top 5 recruiting, top 5 in this recruiting class. Wendell Carter is not a star in the NBA by any means, but when you talk about NBA glue guys, he's averaged over 12 points, over 8 rebounds, 2 assists per game with the Orlando Magic, key player on their playoff team. Not everyone's going to be LeBron James. Not everyone's going to be Jalen Brunson. You need Wendell Carters in the NBA. Wendell Carter is going to be in the NBA for a long time. He's probably going to have a 10, 11, 12, if not longer, year career. He is a boom.
We're climbing into the top 5 now, number 4 with Mo Bamba. I think the expectations just keep raising, so I'm going to call him a bust. He had a good year at Texas. Nothing spectacular, but solid. Of course, I think that was the year where he was a big, sensation in the music industry. But as far as his basketball career is concerned, he was drafted 6th overall. Aside from one good year in Orlando, just hasn't amounted into a great NBA player. He's still around. He plays for the Sixers, just nothing really of note. And like I said, if you're the 4th overall recruit, the expectations are high. So maybe he's like in the late teens or the 20s. I'd call him a boom just because he's in the NBA. But at number 4, I'm calling him a bust.
I'm going to give an interesting pick here for DeAndre Ayton, the third overall player in this recruiting class. Obviously, has spent some time in his career between the Suns, between Portland. I am going to call DeAndre Ayton a bust. I'm basing this off of the fact that people forget that he was the guy at Arizona. That year, DeAndre Ayton was a big deal. There's no denying that. Not every big man in high school even lives up to it in college, because sometimes, you just get that physicality even from high school to college and you can't live up to it. Well, DeAndre Ayton punished other guys. He was putting up numbers at Arizona. And right now, he's kind of following that Andre Drummond trajectory, where is DeAndre Ayton worth having out there? Is he just a guy that kind of does what he does, but does he really help you win the games? Like Wendell Carter just seems like he gives all that energy for the Magic. I don't know if DeAndre Ayton has that same pull, especially with how much money he's expected to make and things like that. I'm actually going to say that DeAndre Ayton is bust. And I'm probably going to get some heat for that, but that's my pick.
Yeah. I don't know. Just like if we're just that one amazing year he had in college.
Yeah.
I feel like that's almost enough to just like he stamped himself in the basketball world. But then again, after that, I see exactly what you're saying. Number 2, Michael Porter is, I'm calling him a boom. I know, like, number 2 overall recruit, you're expecting absolute superstar. He's not a superstar in the NBA, but a real solid player. I'd say good to great player, I would say, actually. So he never ended up playing at Missouri until the SEC tournament. He was just injured, ended up playing a couple games. I think he came off the bench, like didn't really have anything of significance at Missouri. But he was drafted 14th overall, and he's had, like I said, he's been a good to great player with the Denver Nuggets, absolutely a boom. And his role is just a lights-out three-point shooter. He's 41% in his career. Nuggets won it all last year, and he was a big part of that team.
Yeah, I mean, just to go on that a little bit, I mean, Michael Porter Jr., if he didn't go through the college injuries, the NBA injuries, I mean, he has the talent where we could be talking about a guy who averages 24, 25, 26 a game in the NBA. And especially, he even could be a 20-point per game scorer. He's on the Nuggets, who have so many offensive options. Nikola Jokic, Jamal Murray, and he still puts up some numbers. But again, he obviously knows his role. So I do agree with your pick. Marvin Bagley is a bust. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. He was the 2nd overall pick in the draft. Again, I know he's put up some okay stats in the NBA, but when you talk about the number 2 pick in the draft, you're talking about a guy who should be able to be the anchor of a team, and Marvin Bagley is far from that. And that's unfortunate because I thought that he had a ton of talent at Duke. Again, kind of like Ayton. I mean, he was a big deal that year. I actually saw him play. I had a credential for one of the games that I think it was the Champions Classic, or it might have been a Duke St. John's game. But either way, it was at the Garden. I was watching Marvin Bagley courtside warm up, and this was one of my first credentials here with CBB Review. It might have been, I think it was actually my first ever credential because Duke got beat that game by St. John's, if I remember correctly. But one of the highlights was the fact that I was watching Marvin Bagley and I was like 10 feet away from him. And I'm like, this is awesome. Unfortunately, his career in the NBA has been far from awesome. And yeah, Marvin Bagley's a bust.
This year in college basketball, though, we just reviewed the 2017-2018 year. That was like peak regular season ball, like with some of the players that were in there. I mean, I'm a Virginia fan, so obviously, like we lost to UMBC, but it was, maybe I'm biased, but it was really fun watching that season. And this was a fun exercise. We're going to do the next 4 recruiting classes after this because enjoyed this a lot. But that'll do it for today's episode. Be sure to subscribe and follow us on the socials. You can see on the bottom of the screen. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, and take care.